So I wanted to talk about some advanced behavioral concepts, and I'm a behavior nerd, and I'm guessing if you're at this conference, you're a behavior nerd as well, and this is our folk, right? But a friend of mine who is a really savvy Bay Area dog trainer had mentioned once she saw something about delayed discounting, and I thought, oh, she didn't know about this, and I really thought that she had a lot of knowledge in this, and I thought, well, there are things that I can still bring to the community. So I'm going to talk about some other dimensions of animal behavior and what controls behavior. And I do this not to scare you on how complex behavior is. You already know how complex it is, and you can recognize how wonderfully you're doing already with all these problems, with all these things that are already making behavior change complex. When I watched Ken Ramirez's talk and Daryl Hoffman's talk and the amazing things they're doing in zoos and out in the real world, and you think when we go through all these things that are going on and controlling behavior, and yet our tools are so wonderful that we can overcome them. So let's talk about animal training. It's easy, right? How many of you think it's super easy? Yeah. We just deliver a reinforcer after the desired behavior, that's it, or we can deliver a punisher or put the undesired behavior on extinction. This is a quote: using positive reinforcement to train your dog means you reward the behavior you like and ignore the behaviors you do not like. You can use treats, praise, or life rewards to reward your dog's good behavior. It sounds so wonderful in a textbook. And you read it and you think, this is easy, right? I can do this. And I think Sasha and I both have had the experience of very well-educated people telling us, well, it's so easy, you just deliver a reinforcer. Like, hold on, there's more to it than that. So what are some of the challenges that you're coming up against? The first is that your learner has a history of reinforcement and punishment, and it really matters. That matters, what they know already when they come to your table to get treatment. And that history might largely be unknowable. You don't know in what conditions they've been punished, in what conditions have they been reinforced. This is why I think that physicists and chemists have it easy, right? It doesn't matter what the oxygen atom was doing before it's in front of the chemist now. It's just an oxygen atom. And for us, we have this huge, long history. And so what happens before to our animal matters to what we're doing with them now, whereas the chemist is just an oxygen atom. So you can tell your chemist friends they have it super easy. You have a much more complex system to work in. The next is trying to identify and control reinforcers, and this is one of our biggest issues, right? Is trying to find reinforcers that will work for our animal and try to identify the reinforcers that are currently functioning to maintain that behavior, especially when we're thinking about problem behavior. Why is the dog doing this? Why is the horse doing this? And identifying those reinforcers. So the first problem is identification. I'm not going to talk too much about that. We'll talk about how to assess them and find some other reinforcers. We won't look at how to identify the current functioning reinforcer for problem behavior, but if you want to look at that, there are talks on functional analyses and things like that. The other issue, of course, is controlling reinforcers. If we can't control the reinforcer, you're kind of sunk, right? You need to be able to withhold that reinforcer until the desired behavior occurs and then deliver it contingent on that good behavior. And that's easier said than done. So a lot of these reinforcers can be really hard to control. So some of the things I'm going to talk about in this talk are a lot of the variables influencing reinforcer efficacy, including the quality of the reinforcer, the quantity of the reinforcer. We'll talk some about behavioral contrast and delayed reinforcement. Of course, schedule of reinforcement matters in there too, but we won't discuss that so much today. And then we'll go through some complex contingencies where we have competing contingencies that are occurring. Sometimes we focus on our one behavior and omit everything else that's going on. There's a lot more going on. So let's talk first briefly about identifying reinforcers. And this is not identifying reinforcers that are currently maintaining problem behavior, but how do we find reinforcers that we can train with? So this crowd, I'm sure, has this down, but I try and make sure everybody's on the same page anyway, that reinforcers are defined functionally. So if the consequence doesn't increase the future likelihood of a behavior, it's not a reinforcer. So when you have those clients that tell you, oh, I've tried reinforcement before, it doesn't work, you know that's not correct. Reinforcement, by definition, works. They just have to find a consequence that functions as a reinforcer. The first thing to think about is that the learner decides what a reinforcer is. So we don't get to decide. We need to look and see what effect our consequence actually has on that behavior. And if it's not having the desired effect, we need to change consequences. So just because I love chocolate, there are some strange people in this world who do not love chocolate. And I might try and reinforce their behavior with chocolate, thinking, well, I love it, you must love it, and then be shocked to find that it doesn't actually work the way I want it to. So just because something follows a behavior doesn't mean it's a reinforcer. So sometimes we'll look at a system and we'll see the behavior occur and something happen after it. And until we actually show that there's a functional relationship between those two, we don't know if that consequence is actually a reinforcer or just something that happens and doesn't actually have an effect on behavior. So how can we identify reinforcers? We have to look at the effect on behavior. And when I think about controlling and identifying reinforcers, I always think back to my parents' basset hounds. I know Margie has her beagle, so she knows the hound life. Anyone else have hounds in their lives? Yes, you have special challenges, right? To me, these are incredibly smart dogs. I think sometimes they don't act as smart compared to, like, I have shepherds and mals, and they're like busy and doing what I say. And the hounds are equally smart. My parents' bassets were really, really clever and discriminating, and they had my parents trained down pat. So the thing that I think is different about these animals is how controllable their reinforcers are. For my shepherds, I control their reinforcers. I have their favorite ball, I have their favorite treats, we can play fetch, I have all of that. And my parents had hounds that found the environment and the smells on the ground way more reinforcing than anything else. So they were really smart, but they were harder to train because we didn't control all their reinforcers as readily. So let's take a look at how effective a reinforcer is. And there are a couple different ways of measuring this. The first is how much responding will it maintain. And what I'm going to show you is some data that Clive Wynn and I had collected, where we looked at sort of a relative measure. Reinforcers using food and social interaction and its effect on an arbitrary response. The second is how fast is the responding. So how quickly does the animal re-engage? When we present our cue, our discriminative stimulus, how quickly does the animal respond? And then finally, I'll present some data where we look at the schedule of responding, how much can be maintained using a progressive ratio schedule to see at what point will the animal stop working. So really, these are different ways of assessing reinforcer efficacy, and those are all things we really care about as trainers, right? We want fast responding. We would like to be able to maintain a lot of responding for a given reinforcer. So these are things that when we're assessing reinforcer efficacy, these are the very things that matter to us as trainers. The other thing that I think having effective reinforcers are really important for is that if we have sort of an automatically reinforced behavior like sniffing, leash pulling because they get stimulus change as they pull, predatory behavior, we need to be able to compete with those. And so we need to identify and develop effective reinforcers. So let's first start with quality of reinforcement. Not all reinforcers are equal. And as I mentioned, I'm a chocoholic, so this would be highly reinforcing for me, but you could pull something else out of the food category, like Brussels sprouts, and that would not be a reinforcer for me, and it would likely possibly be a punisher. So just because you say, I'm going to give the dog food, doesn't mean that all food items are equal, and you likely already know this, but we'll look at some data. Some might be better for certain behaviors as well, so we'll talk about this. I'm going to talk about food versus social interaction, and we use the same response to assess them in this, but I think that there might be some differences between what behaviors is food good for. It's a pretty stimulating consequence. It might be better for maintaining active behaviors, whereas petting might be great for calm behaviors. So we'll look at food versus social interaction as a reinforcer. This is a shelter dog you're going to see. She has to emit a nose touch to the experimenter's hand, and contingent on that, she's given a small piece of food in the food condition, or 4 seconds of social interaction, petting and praise. We chose that. 4 seconds is pretty cheap, right? Clive always said, you know, it's like getting a 4-second massage. You probably wouldn't come back there. So it's pretty cheap, but we picked it because it equated the time of delivery for the food. This is a shelter dog. We're in a pretty noisy environment. There's a bank of finches behind us, so Again, we have to find reinforcers that can outweigh those other consequences. So she has figured out this vending machine, right? She knows how it works. And as you read dog behavior, you can see she's not thrilled with this, right? Anyway, but she tries it one more time. Like I thought we had something going here. But no luck. Suddenly the finches are fun. There are other things to look at. Yeah. And later on in that, she actually lays down, so I told people that I was measuring how best to bore dogs. So these are her data, and you can see she alternates between 3 sessions of food, 3 sessions of social interaction. In this condition, she had a maximum of 15 trials, so a maximum of 15 nose touches. So you can see that she was getting maximum responding for food and almost what looked like extinction curves for social. We had 5 dogs that did that, and some of our dogs were counterbalanced. They started in social and went to food, and we'll talk about behavioral contrast in a little bit. And 3 dogs that were unimpressed with either interaction, especially Bear down here. And we didn't do a preference assessment before, so possibly other types of food would have been more reinforcing for him. And then finally, we had this lovely little pit bull cross who thought social and food were as fantastic as they both were. To the point that I was actually concerned that something else was maintaining that behavior. So I threw in 2 sessions of extinction, that's where you see that downward slope, to make sure that it wasn't just some weird respondent behavior she had. The responding did decrease, and when you put food and social back in, she was back at maximum responding. So this is on the multi-species track, and so I don't have any cat data to show you, but I thought I'd show you some cute pictures of my cats. So what about latency to respond? So this is data from that same data set that I just showed you, where they work through 3 sessions of social, then food, then social, then food, and this is a cumulative record. So every response that the animal emits, they tick up 1 bit. So you can look at the slope of the line and see how fast they're responding. So in those red, you can see that the responding was really low. It's a low rate of responding, that's in social. In the black, that's food, really high rates of responding. So again, what we saw before, that the food maintained more responding, it also maintained shorter latencies, suggesting again a more effective reinforcer. And if you're wondering about that little pit bull girl, I thought, well, maybe her latencies are different between food and social, but no, she responded as quickly for social as she did for food, which is really lovely. We would love to find more dogs like her. So we thought, well, maybe owner attention will be more valuable. These are shelter dogs. They don't know the experimenter. They have no history of reinforcement there. So we looked at owned dogs, and now we put in an extinction session as well, because we wanted to compare social and extinction. This is my dog, so I'll tell you that my dog loves food more than my social interaction as well. I loved him just as much. So you get maximum or really high responding in food, and now we've changed the sessions to 3 minutes long, so there's no cap on how fast they can respond. So he's getting almost 36 nose touches in some of these. We had 4 dogs that showed this pattern with high responding in food and low in social, and sometimes looking almost, again, like extinction. We didn't see a huge difference between social and extinction. And then 2 dogs that, again, were unimpressed with either social or food. So again, here's my multi-species track, horses. This is not my data. This is data from Sankinel, but that's my horse, so he's cute. They looked at food versus social interaction with horses as well. And for them, they gave a little bit of grain, or the grooming was 3 scratches on the withers, which is sort of a common way of telling a horse it did a good job. What they looked at, they were training the horse to stand still. And across 6 days, they measured how long had the horse learned to stand still. They had 5-minute sessions. You can see the food in the black bars and the grain, in the grooming in the light gray bars, and that's the total time the horse had learned to stand still. So we see that across those 6 days, food produced a lot of learning, right? The horse learned the task quite well. With the grooming, it sort of petered out. They didn't get much above that asymptote there. What I think is really interesting about this as well is they looked at some side effects too. They looked at the latency to approach. So after this training, they put the experimenter in the middle of the stable and asked how long will it take the horse to come near the experimenter. So you can see again the food on the left and the grain on the right, and before and after. So you can see that before, the food horses and the grooming horses were at about the same latency to approach, but after training, those food horses were zooming right over to the experimenter. And I think that's what we see, right? That we use positive reinforcement and an actual reinforcer, not just an assumed reinforcer like potentially grooming is, and we see affiliative behavior. We see approach behavior and engaging in the session, which is really, really wonderful. They also looked at time spent near the human, and we see that the food horses spent significantly longer after training and significantly longer compared to the grooming horses near the experimenter as well. This all sort of corroborates what we know about our training methods. So let's take a look at quantity effects. What if we stay with the same reinforcer, but look at different quantities? And what I'm going to do here, we're actually going to look at two things. One is the delivery method. Does how we deliver the food to the dog matter? And how sensitive are they to magnitude? So we had two conditions. The dog, again, was using a nose touch, and they were on a progressive ratio schedule. So they had nose touch, get a reinforcer, nose touch, reinforcer. Then they had to do two nose touches to get reinforcer, two nose touches, then to three. And we measured their break points. At what schedule will they stop responding? And we did it two different ways. The dogs either got 4 whole treats all at once, or they got 4 treats delivered one by one by one while we told them what great puppies they were. So this is the idea of kind of making a party. What if we add vocal praise? What if we stretch this delivery out just a little bit? So this is exactly what I kind of went through. When the dog met the schedule requirement, we did use a conditioned reinforcer. We used a novel one the dog hadn't experienced before, si or ya, and one of those was associated with one delivery type. The other was associated with the other delivery type. We counterbalanced that across dogs, but it was the same within a dog. So this is what it looks like, nose touch.
What a good boy. York is being such a good dog. What a good puppy.
I enroll all my dogs in my studies, so that's my dog.
Yeah. What a good dog.
That's their price of admission.
Such a good pup.
So he's on an FR1 there,
What a good dog.
and now he'll go to an FR2 since he completed 2 FR1s. This is what it looked like when he was getting all 4 treats all at once. And he's already up on his schedule a little bit, so you'll see a few nose touches.
See?
So he's on it. That was his second FR4, so this next time you'll see him have to work on an FR5.
See?
So what does that look like? These are his break points, so this is the largest schedule he completed before stopping responding, and stopping responding was stopping for 1 minute. And you can see that we don't see a huge difference between those two delivery types, the 1 by 1 in black or the all 4 at once in the open triangles. We did some further analyses that I won't talk about. There might be some minor differences, and it might be contingent on the size of the reinforcer, but generally you don't see a huge effect. And he's coming in at about, an FR13, so he's typically emitting 13 nose touches before he stops. Sometimes it's higher, but on average, he's completing an FR13 before he decides that our reinforcers are not that valuable. Then we looked at magnitude, and we cut magnitude by 1/4. So before he was getting 4 treats, now he's only getting 1 treat. So what happens to his responding? It decreases. So we see his breakpoints decrease to about an FR6. So he is sensitive to magnitude. And when we reverse to a large reinforcer, his work ethic goes right up, right? Work ethic, but by that we mean the schedule effects on behavior. So we do see he's sensitive to magnitude. This is Ninja in the large condition on the left, then she went to small. You can see again sensitivity to magnitude, but you can also notice that she is not as hard a worker as Yorick. She's coming in at about an FR6 on average, with the big treats an FR3 on the small. And then we reverse to large, and her breakpoints increase again. Then we tested spike. These were the large, and we kind of moved at a bad point where we had a decreasing trend in the large. But when we reverse, we see an increase again in his breakpoints. And then it's possible that the small maintained less responding only because it followed the large. So we reversed this in one dog, Sammy. She started with small, went to large treats, and then went back to small. So we see across the dogs, not a huge effect of delivery method, but sensitivity to magnitude. So if we kind of summarize this with the breakpoints, Yorick had a breakpoint on the large with about an FR 12.5 and a breakpoint on the small of 6.3. One thing we did was we wanted to look at this in terms of unit price. How much responding is the dog giving for each reinforcer? So remember the large magnitude had 4 treats. So he was emitting about 12.5 nose touches to earn 4 treats. Whereas on the small, he was emitting 6 nose touches to earn 1 treat. So what we do to calculate unit price is just divide by the amount of reinforcement he earned in both situations. So we divided 12.5 by 4 and got 3.1. We divided 6.3 by 1 because it was 1 treat. So this is a way of assessing how much is the dog paying, how much responding will it maintain, and how much will he pay to get that reinforcer. And we say that this way he's paying almost twice as much for those small reinforcers. So in fact, that he's sensitive to magnitude, but not as sensitive as he should be. He cut his responding by about half, whereas we cut our reinforcer magnitude by 1/4. And we saw this trend across all 4 dogs, where they're spending more for the small treats than they are for the big treats. So in fact, what we find is that they are sensitive to the quantity of reinforcement, but not as sensitive as they should be. So there are a couple takeaways. Oh, yes?
I'm just, I wasn't quite clear. So you gave the 4 at 1, or you gave the 4 in a row.
Right.
But you did also change your
Magnitude.
Well, you changed your socialization at the same time. So why did you do that as well?
With the vocal praise?
Right.
Because we thought if we were going to see an effect, we're going to see it with vocal praise and delivering it this way.
Yeah, I guess that's where I'm confused. Why didn't you break that up?
We thought, well, if we're going to see an effect, we're going to see it in that condition, and then if we do, then we can separate it, but we didn't see an effect, so we didn't separate it. Yeah. So there are a couple takeaways. One is that likely you can use those small reinforcers to maintain a pretty good amount of behavior, maybe more than we would have expected. It also suggests that if you were to increase your magnitude of reinforcement, your dog will be sensitive to it, but maybe not as sensitive as you like. So maybe you double your reinforcement rate thinking, I'm going to get double the behavior out, but you may not. So, but I think it speaks well to our focus on using small treats as potentially we get a lot of behavior, at least pretty simple behaviors. So when we're thinking about using what we know about quality and quantity of reinforcement in training, it's really focusing on which behaviors are most important to you and trying to deliver the bigger treats, the more valuable treats for the behaviors that have become more important for you. So is the dog engaging too frequently in in one behavior compared to another behavior? Those of you that compete in agility, you might have tunnel suck, right? The dog is like, I see that A-frame, but I also see a tunnel, and off I go. So maybe we have to then differentially reinforce, and it doesn't mean we have to extinguish or punish the other. It just means we have to deliver our bigger quantity, our better quality reinforcers for the behaviors that aren't occurring at a high enough rate. And we can change our reinforcer quality across alternatives and the change rate of reinforcement across alternatives. So we can use that to our advantage and really think what's going on with our dog. They have multiple options at a given time. And if they're not doing what we want them to do, how do I preferentially reinforce this, this behavior to bring the dog to a higher rate of responding there? I alluded already to behavioral contrast. This is a change in the rate or quality of reinforcement in one schedule. So we have 2 schedules, either concurrent or sequential in a multiple schedule. And if we change one component, but we don't touch the other component, we should see that second component stay the same. We didn't change anything in it, right? But with contrast, what we see is that we change rate of reinforcement or quality of reinforcement in one schedule, and we get this weird effect in this other schedule that we didn't touch. So contrast can occur with different rates of reinforcement, but it can also occur with the same rate of reinforcement, but different reinforcer qualities. So what we do to assess this is you start with equal rates of reinforcement and equal types of reinforcement, which is what they did here. These are pigeons working for oats on 2 different schedules. One has is associated with a green light and one associated with a red light. Then you switch one component. So we increase the value of reinforcer in one component. And this is what they did. They gave the animal their preferred item, peas for, I think, 3 of these pigeons, and mixed grain for a 4th pigeon. And we see an increase in the rate of that, which is these open circles. So we would expect that, right? I give you better reinforcement, you're going to work more for me. But what happens on the other schedule is we get a simultaneous decrease in responding there. We didn't even change that component, but responding decreased because the other schedule became richer. And then in the 3rd panel, they reverse that, and the responding comes back together. So this is the data I already showed you, and one of our concerns then was this contrast effect. This is essentially a multiple schedule for us, where they have a food schedule, and then they go to social, and then they go to food. And so it's possible that any low responding in the social component was not due to social not being much of a reinforcer, but in fact being due to coming after food, right? And that you've got, social was great, but you told me you have food, then, I don't care about your social anymore. So what we did with this was we gave dogs a longer exposure to the social interaction before they contacted food. So now we gave the dogs 12 sessions with social to see if, can we get you learning? Can we get you responding for this brief social interaction? And then we put in a food phase to see, okay, maybe you're just a low responder. What will you do for food? And so we see with this dog that, across 12 sessions, there's not much responding for social, but responding increases once we start using food as our consequence. So we had 4 dogs that showed that nice pattern, and in fact, Lily the bloodhound is hard, right? She had 1 response, got social interaction, was like, I'm done with you. And then we had 3, again, that showed some variable responding, and we didn't see as clear a trend between social and food. And I think some of these, like that dog Z there in letter F, is suggestive that maybe social can be reinforcing in some situations. And I'm not going to present this data, but we have some evidence that for some dogs, if we deliver social in a more spread out fashion, remember this is nose touch, social, nose touch, social, nose touch, social. So it's possible that social is a reinforcer, but satiates very quickly, and that if we spread out the way we deliver it across the day, it might be more effective. And we have some data that suggests that if you don't ask the dog to do this multiple times just for social, but you give them some social here and some social there and some social over here, that it can maintain responding. And I think some of the work from Jesus Rosales-Ruiz's lab, and what he's probably going to talk about later, is using social as a reinforcer. They've done some really great work for using this with shelter dogs for calm behavior. And like I said, it's a low effort nose touch, but it's still an active response. And so it's possible that this is a reinforcer if you use it on different schedules or with different behaviors. So how can you use what you know about behavioral contrast in practice? And it might be that you're using Charlie bears for all your behaviors. And then you decide that you need to use steak for teaching it down. So you go to steak, and then you come back to your Charlie bear behaviors, and they're at a lower rate. The dog has now shown you some behavioral contrast. So if you're wondering why the responding for Charlie bears, those behaviors that you've been using Charlie bears with, has decreased, it might not have anything to do with that. It might be the fact that you've got this other schedule that the dog has contacted. And there's a contrast there. So this is, again, where all those things become really challenging to meter out. And so I think it's impressive the behavior change you all can produce. So let's talk about then delay to reinforcement. So we all know that timing matters, right? And this is one of the things I think we struggle with a lot with our clients. You're watching them and you're like, reinforce your dog when it sits. Now, like 5 minutes ago, you should have gotten that reinforcer out. So we know timing matters, but I think it's fun to look at some of the other angles of timing, that it ends up mattering even more than we think. So how does delay affect reinforcer or punisher value? So the first thing we know is that by delaying those, we can potentially reinforce the wrong behavior, right? You've asked your dog to watch, it looks at you, and you're late, and by now it's like staring at the cat, and now you've reinforced staring at the cat. The other, which I think is always much more dangerous, is punishing the wrong behavior, and we've all seen this, right? Where the dog doesn't recall at the dog park, and then finally comes over to the owner and it gets whacked. And you think, what did your dog just learn? Don't come near you. So they've really laid on the punishment, really punishing the wrong behavior. Beyond that, though, reinforcers and punishers lose value with delay. And this is what we'll talk about, the delay to, what's called delay discounting. So when we're thinking about delay discounting, this is really, it'll be construed as impulsive behavior versus self-controlled behavior. The impulsive choice is going for a smaller reinforcer that's available sooner versus a larger reinforcer that's delivered later. And I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges we have, especially for our own behavior. When we're thinking about it, saving the environment, when we think about making good savings choices, how we spend our money, this delay discounting really, throws a wrench in all of our wonderful plans about how we're going to eat well and lose weight and save a lot of money. So these are some of the examples that you get pitted against every day, right? These are delay discounting issues. The smaller, sooner reinforcer versus a larger, later reinforcer. Do you want the cupcake now, which is smaller reinforcer but immediate? Or do you want to forego that and have a salad later, and 3 weeks down the line, maybe you've lost a pound of weight, right? So we have a small, sooner reinforcer versus this large, later reinforcer. And as much as we'd love to have, the large, later reinforcer, that small, sooner is really powerful. This is one that I always struggle with. Do you want to sleep in now? Or go to the gym and be healthy later? We'd be so much better off if you walked into the gym and you immediately lost a half a pound of weight, right? Then we would go to the gym regularly. But that's not how it works. You have to go to the gym for a month or so before you finally see an effect of all those early mornings. Do you want to buy a new video game now, or should you save that $50 and put it towards the house you want to buy? Again, we're pitted against these issues all the time. Driving to work or saving the environment, right? Yes, I'd love to get up and take the bus, but I'm just going to sleep in and I'll drive my car. And those long-term effects of ruining the environment don't control a lot of my behavior. And I think this plays into how we deal with our dogs too. I run agility with my shepherd, and this is what I think of sometimes, that we have smaller, sooner reinforcers in our animal training as well, and there are larger, later reinforcers. So when I'm on an agility trial and I've cued my dog inappropriately, he takes the jump that I've told him to, but it's off course, or I see him heading that way. What do? Do I reroute him? Do I call him back and likely punish him even though he correctly listened to my bad cue? Do I do that to get my smaller, sooner reinforcer getting a qualifying run? Or do I accept that we're not going to get that smaller, sooner reinforcer and instead preserve my relationship with him, that he knows he can trust my cues and I have to work on my cueing? So there's, again, a smaller, sooner, that immediate cue versus this larger, later, good relationship where he knows he can trust my cues. So think about this when you're out competing. You've got a delay discounting issue in front of you. And I'm guessing this is where some of the aversive trainers come in too, right? That they get immediate results, fast. Punishers work immediately, and we can see that even if it's not a great punisher, likely an immediate suppression of behavior, so you get this immediate reinforcer at the cost of this long-term relationship with the dog. So one of the questions is, how quickly do reinforcers or punishers lose value? Maybe we've got a while, right? Maybe we've got 5 minutes before they start to lose value. Unfortunately, they lose value almost immediately. So this is some pigeon work, and essentially what you see down here is the delay to reinforcement. And if you read up on the Y value, that tells you how much it's valued at by the animal right now. So, and they put this in ratios, the sort of the proportion of how reinforcing it would be immediately. So what you can see is that there is a steep decline with just a little bit of delay. And those are delays in seconds. So within like 2 seconds, this animal has pretty much halved the reinforcer value. So it doesn't take much to lose a lot of value. The longer the delay, we still get decrements in reinforcer value, but there's not as big a change. It's those small delays where we get huge losses of value. And so maybe it's just these pigeons, right, that engage in these impulsive behaviors of smoking and gambling and all of this. If we look at rats, though, we see the same effect, with small delays producing rapid decreases in value. And I won't put up human data, but humans are no better at this. We are very sensitive to delays. We're probably better than rats and pigeons. We have verbal behavior and we can give ourselves rules and instructions to try and bridge some of those gaps, but we still have delay discounting issues that we contend with. So where do we see delays to reinforcement? So knowing that just a delay of like a couple seconds and the treat that I'm giving you is now, I might as well be giving you half of the treat if I gave it to you immediately. I've lost a lot of value of that reinforcer. So where do we see this cropping up? So working dogs for sure, right? We see them having to engage in behaviors, long chains of behavior before they earn their reinforcer. When I was in Montana, we used to partner with working dogs for conservation, and they would have their dogs, go out and detect like cheetah scat, not cheetah in Montana, but maybe wolverine. We're not that exotic. Wolverine scat. And so the dog would alert to it and indicate that they found something. The handler would have to come before they delivered a reinforcer. They would come and verify it. So it couldn't just be, oh, that's bobcat scat. I need to make sure that's wolverine scat. So it wasn't good enough that the dog found scat. They had to determine that it was the exact scat they wanted. So the dog had to be like waiting there, like, I hope this turns out good, right? It's like us waiting for exam results, like, I hope I did okay on that. So there's a long delay before they deliver that reinforcer. Anything with long chains of behavior, agility or obedience, any of these performing animals, our sport animals, they engage in a lot of behavior before they ever reach that terminal reinforcer. And one of the things that keeps us going with that is that within that chain, we have conditioned reinforcers, right? That I tell my dog to take a jump, and he takes the jump, and now when I say he's taking the jump and I tell him to go tunnel, that my cue, go tunnel, acts as a conditioned reinforcer of the prior behavior. So this is how we get those long chains of behavior not being so affected by delays to reinforcement. Dogs with slow owners, right? This is probably what we contend with the most, are these poor dogs that like sat and then they're just sitting there waiting and the owner's fumbling or talking to a friend. And so we have these really slow owners, and so the dog has to contend with that. And then they wonder why the dog, doesn't do what they ask, right? So with all of these, let me go back. With all of these, this is where we have to deal with those delays to reinforcement, and we have to be aware of those. And so we'll talk about some ways to overcome that. And I'm just going to put in here that sensitivity to delay is sort of trait-like. We see that within a person or within an animal, that across reinforcers, their sensitivity to delay is similar. So if you can't stand not waiting for chocolate, that would be me, you might be more impulsive on other things as well. We also see that there are some effects that if people are addicted to drugs, then they're likely to engage more impulsively. So it might be that they were more impulsive to begin with and got this addiction, but it's also possible that being on that drug makes them more impulsive. And that seems to be part of the evidence that, when they give birds cocaine, the birds become more impulsive. And when they take them off cocaine, it's not like the birds are like, okay, I've got self-control again. It actually takes them a while to sort of recover back to their prior less impulsive state. We also see this with folks that are experiencing poverty, that they will engage in more impulsive behavior. So I think all of this speaks to our need to understand what controls behavior before we judge people or judge animals and really take a more compassionate look at them. So how can we reduce the effect? One is using conditioned reinforcers to kind of bridge that gap, especially with these long chains of behavior. That buys us some time and keeps the animal not experiencing a full delay. So it's not like you set your dog up at the beginning of an agility course and 40 seconds later they finally get their reinforcer, which we know would be almost zero value by the time that happened. That gap in time can be bridged by those conditioned reinforcers. The other is to use large reinforcers because they lose value slightly less quickly. And I didn't talk about this when I showed you those graphs, but they were of different magnitudes of reinforcement. And the larger the magnitude of reinforcement, the less sensitive it was to a delay. So if you have these slow owners, try and get them to give big magnitude reinforcement, which is, again, a hard task, right? Most of our owners don't want to use food or are kind of chintzy with their food delivery. And actually, that just reminds me, I didn't tell you this when I was talking about the food delivery and the giving the treats one by one and whether that affected behavior. We didn't see a lot of effect of that on the dog's behavior. My guess is that it might affect the owner behavior, that when you tell your owner, give lots of little treats, they might end up giving more than they would have if you said give one big treat, and that's where that magnitude comes in. Just realized I didn't tell you that part. So with our owners, maybe, and us too, now that I recognize this, whenever I'm slow on delivering a reinforcer, I try to give a bigger, better one than I normally would have to try and bridge that delay. The other is you can certainly train the animal to tolerate delay, and likely when we talk about people that are self-controlled, they have learned behaviors along the way to engage in to help them tolerate that delay. And if you look at the marshmallow experiment where they'd give kids marshmallows, you can have one now, or if you wait 15 minutes, you can have two. And these are like 5-year-old kids that are just like, I want the marshmallow. The ones that succeeded oftentimes engage in these sort of interim behaviors. They'd sit on their hands, or they'd look away, or they'd do something other than just stare at this marshmallow, which would be really tempting. So we can do that with our dogs as well. And if you go back and watch some of those videos, they're really fun. Some of the kids will be licking the marshmallow. How can I enjoy this and still get my second marshmallow? So we can certainly train the animal to tolerate delay. And if I'm delayed, I do try and keep talking to my dog to let them know it's coming. I'm sorry, mommy's slow, but it's coming. But actually building in, I think this is what a lot of the working folks do, is initially you're delivering immediate rewards when the dog's learning. Once the dog has the task, you might ask them to wait a second or two before you deliver the reinforcer. And so they learn to actually tolerate that delay. All right, next we're going to talk about competing contingencies, because there's never just one contingency in place, right? We tend to focus down on our behavior of interest and the contingency that it's caught up in, but there's so much more that's going on. First of all, that behavior can produce multiple consequences. It can potentially produce reinforcers and punishers. And I always put in here that effort is, I think, a constant contingency, right? The amount of effort that an animal exerts is always a contingency we have to think about, because evolutionarily speaking, it's useful for us to conserve energy, because before we had modern agriculture, we never knew if we were going to get our next meal. Same thing with our animals. They've been selected to be efficient behaviors. So if you make the task really hard, they're likely not going to engage in it. So this is where we always say make the right response easy, right? Because we're dealing with that effort contingency. Having to exert a lot of effort is punishing. That's another reason we don't go to the gym when we should. And I think that's also why considering unit price, how much work are you having to do to get this reinforcer, is maybe even more useful than just looking at what's my schedule of reinforcement. But how much work are you having to put out for a unit of reinforcement? So within one behavior, it can have multiple consequences. And of course, there are multiple different behaviors available at any given time for an animal, and those all have different contingencies as well. If you ever took Gen Psych, you'll see these discussed, and I think we can make them behavior analytic instead of just talking about this general conflict. So the approach avoidance conflict, this is essentially when a behavior produces both a reinforcer and a punisher. So you're like, I don't know, I think I want to do that, but it might go badly too. So this is, some other psychologists, non-behavior analytic folks would describe this as conflict. Approach, when you have two mutually exclusive behaviors that each produce a reinforcer. So this is essentially a concurrent schedule. I have, I can get chocolate over here, I can play with puppies over there, and what am I going to do? So I have two mutually exclusive behaviors that each produce a reinforcer. Avoidance, when there are two behaviors, both of which produce punishers, you'd probably try and just avoid both and find a third alternative if you can. Or double approach avoidance, where you have two mutually exclusive behaviors, each of which produce some reinforcement and some punishment. So this is where we start to get really complex, right? How do you decide what you're going to do? And this is where we will think about weighing our options, but what do our animals do? We can't ask them to write down how they're weighing their options. But really, I think we can take these sort of psychology terms and think about them in terms of what consequences are they producing. So our goal is always to predict and control behavior. We want to know when is the animal going to engage in a specific behavior, under what conditions, and if it's a problem behavior, how can I change it? Or how do I get the animal to engage in desirable behavior more frequently? So we're going to talk about this in terms of choice. When an animal, and can be defined as an animal allocates response to one alternative over another. So again, like I said, oftentimes we focus on, I'm teaching your dog to sit, but there are all these other alternatives, right? The dog could be chasing the squirrel or visiting the neighbor dog. So there are all these other alternatives the dog could be doing. And so we want to understand what controls the dog's choice. What do I have to do to get the dog to sit with me instead of chasing that squirrel? So we'd love to have our dog come from the park when called rather than sniffing the grass. We'd love to have our horse take a jump rather than dipping to the side and dodging it. So how do we arrange the environment to get the choice out that we want? So at any given moment, there is behavioral choice. Although I think when we say there is no choice, really what's happening is because all those other options are punished. So there is behavioral choice, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it, and functionally there isn't, right, when all the other alternatives we could engage in are going to be heavily punished. So when we're thinking about also giving our animals choice, we have to make sure there are several options that all result in reinforcement for the animal. So in any context, there are several possible sources of reinforcement for your dog. Like I said, my parents' Basset Hound had a very wonderful source of reinforcement in their yard and on walks that didn't involve listening to my parents. So first we have your programmed reinforcement, and we hope that's what's controlling most of the behavior, what you're planning to deliver. It could even be environmental reinforcement, but you're the one, saying, okay, now you go sniff. But we have all that extraneous reinforcement in the environment that we're competing against. So the other food, people, smells, sights, and I think in the last talk, he was talking about the vibration of the door for the elephant. So there could be all these really subtle reinforcers that could be maintaining behavior that we really have to think about. So what affects choice? How does our animal choose to engage with one alternative over another? And this is where, again, those effects of reinforcer quality, quantity, delay, and schedule come back into play. How do animals allocate their choice across alternatives? So if there are two concurrent alternatives, I'm not going to talk much about the matching law, but I'm just going to put it out there, some clarification, that in ratio schedules, so like fixed ratio or variable ratio, they allocate their responding exclusively to the richer schedule. So they don't, in ratio schedules, they don't match. They don't say, well, I'm going to give 50% of my responding here and 50% of my responding over here. They allocate all of their responding to one. You would do the same thing, and in fact you do. If you had a job that paid $25 an hour and a job that paid $5 an hour, if there were no other sources of reinforcement for you, like you really liked the people at the $5 an hour job, or it gave you some other personal benefit, you wouldn't say, well, I'm going to work 4 hours every day at the $25 an hour job, and 4 hours a day at the 5-hour job. You'd say, I'm going to work 8 hours a day at the $25 job. So animals do the same thing. So where do we actually see matching? Why does an animal ever vary then? If we know there's a richer schedule, why would the animal ever leave that richer schedule? And that has to do with motivation. So if you're at Dr. Protopopova's talk prior, she talked about motivation and that motivation can change. And so, yes, I might be working exclusively for chocolate, but at some point I will actually get satiated on chocolate and, you know, maybe want some LaCroix or something. So our motivations change. And so that's what our animals do too, right? That they might get satiated on our food and suddenly that squirrel is more interesting. So you might have a richer schedule at the moment. So they work on the richer schedule at this given moment. In interval schedules, though, that's where we actually see the matching law occurring, where if you get twice as much reinforcement on alternative A as you do on alternative B, you'll allocate twice as much of your responding to A as you do to B. So the matching law, I'm just going to point out, only occurs in interval schedules. So what happens when we have competing contingencies within a given response? What happens when there's a reinforcer and a punisher available for the same response? What happens? And I think this is one of the problems of using punishment. If you're using punishment, you already have a behavior that's established and being maintained by a reinforcer. So you have to think about, how is this reinforcer going to compete with that punisher? And what really happens? So we know there's a maintaining reinforcer. How is our punisher going to affect that behavior? So we'll take a look at how this plays out. And this is some work from Nate Azrin. And what he did was he changed the motivating operations for the animal by decreasing their weight, essentially making the reinforcer more valuable, right? So we have, these are birds that are working on likely an interval schedule. They're getting reinforced for engaging in pecking behavior. So there's this background responding. And then they started delivering punishers, so shocks to the animal as well. So what happens? And what they looked at was, how does the value of the reinforcer affect the efficacy of the punisher? So these are birds, 375 grams or 470, where they're just about at free feeding weight. And we see that when punishment is delivered, it knocks down the behavior because they're not motivated to eat, right? They have plenty of food. So now you've shocked me. I didn't need that food anyway. But what if we reduce the body weight on the animal to 350 or 340 or 460 to 450? Now you see the animal pushing through your punisher because the reinforcer is valuable enough to them that they will experience the punisher because that reinforcer is too valuable. So when we're thinking about using punishers, we really have to think about reducing the value of the maintaining reinforcer. You can certainly use extinction, but we'll talk briefly about using that ethically. But when we're using punishment, if you're not dealing with that reinforcement contingency already, you've got issues. And this is exactly why our penal system doesn't work so well either. You put people in that probably engaged in a behavior like robbing a bank because they don't have enough resources. You put them in jail. You don't give them any other alternative behavior. You come back out. You've tried to punish them. They come back out, but that reinforcer is still too valuable. They'll risk the punisher, right? These birds are risking the punisher to get the reinforcer. And further complicating this is the schedule of punishment. How does delivering the punisher affect behavior? So what happens if you don't punish every target response? How many of your clients, if they try and use punishment, use it effectively and use it every time? Yeah, no, it's like when it's convenient, right? When they feel like it. So what is that actually doing to behavior? So this is, again, from some of Nate Azrin's work, looking at the schedule of punishment. This is an FR1, so the punishment is delivered after every response, and you see that it's effective for reducing the rate of behavior. Every 100th response, we get some substantial responding. And there's our comparison up here with no punishment. So you can see the less frequently it's delivered, the more likely it is for the behavior to persist and maintain. So between both the competing reinforcer and the likelihood that punishment is not delivered every time, we can see how it can be quite ineffective and just really damaging. So our solution then is we have to reduce the motivation for that reinforcer. If there's a reinforcer maintaining that problem behavior, we have to reduce it some way, either by giving it non-contingently, like attention. I'm just going to give you attention throughout the day rather than waiting for you to chew on my shoe as a puppy and give you attention. probably more frequently what we do is try and give the animal an alternative way for accessing that reinforcer. And this is where our differential schedules of reinforcement come in. And I think you should always install that optional behavior, that new alternative behavior, before you ever start using punishment. I think it's unfair to the animal to start using punishment before they have an alternative that they can turn to. This is the same for extinction, that if you are using extinction, don't just put the behavior on extinction. You're going to get extinction bursts and extinction-induced aggression and emotional responding, things you don't usually want to see. If you're trying to get rid of a behavior through extinction, you need to install an alternative behavior the animal can toggle to. And if we don't give the animal another way to access that reinforcer, like an appropriate response, the behavior is going to continue if that reinforcer is valuable enough. If it's more valuable than your punisher is punishing, and if the schedule of reinforcement is variable, which likely with all of our clients, it's going to be. So last, we'll talk about behavioral momentum, looking at how Pavlovian conditioning can interact with operant conditioning. So these are always co-occurring. Like I saw somebody getting some fun body art recently of Pavlov on their shoulder. So we all know that Pavlov is riding along with us with all of our operant contingencies. And sometimes it can be at odds with the operant response, right? This is why in Skinner boxes it can be hard to shape a rat to emit an escape response to shock, because their Pavlovian response to shock is to freeze. So how do I get you to press a lever to turn the shock off when you're busy freezing? We see this with our clients too. The dog urinates in their presence and they smack it to try and punish it, and then the dog, out of submission and fear, urinates some more. So the Pavlovian response can be pushed up against the operant response we're trying to deal with. And the Pavlovian effects with what comes along with our operant conditioning are sometimes the side effects in training that we care about. With positive reinforcement, the affiliative behavior. Using punishment, we produce fear and avoidance and things like this. The other thing that might happen is these two can interact to impact how disruptible a behavior is. How malleable or changeable is that behavior? For example, how easily can I extinguish a given behavior? And this comes in a new field called behavioral momentum, where they combine operant and Pavlovian conditioning and look at how disruptible a behavior is. So how easily can it be changed? So part of how disruptible a behavior is depends on the history of reinforcement, the response reinforcer pairing. So the stronger that is, the longer it's been going on, the more instances of it, the stronger that behavior is. This is a study by Mace with people in a developmental center. And what they did was that they had learned to sort silverware, and this was their baseline, sorting silverware. And you can see the black was on a VI 60 per hour, so they're getting essentially reinforced every minute. And the white VI 15 per hour, you can see there's a little difference, but not much. So the 60 per hour is a much richer schedule. So they have a lot longer history of reinforcement. Now they put a video distraction into that setting. They played a video for these adults. What happens to their behavior? They're both disrupted because they start watching the video, but the thinner schedule, the VI 15 per hour, is disrupted even more. So that's what we know, and this is just looking at the proportion of baseline that it was disrupted. But it turns out it also depends on Pavlovian conditioning. How many times the SD, the cue or the antecedent stimulus, is paired with the reinforcer, independent of responding. So the animal doesn't have to respond in this. The SD just has to be present, and the reinforcer is delivered. And so this is sort of our non-contingent reinforcement. What can happen? So if we look at this with a pigeon on a variable interval schedule, so this is our baseline, and then we compare it, so that's just a sort of a operant contingency, and then we compare it to a pigeon on a variable time, the variable interval schedule this first pigeon is on, plus a variable time schedule. So they are working on this schedule, but then every once in a while, reinforcers are just dropped into the equation. So they get free reinforcers, no response is required. What happens in extinction? So these birds have equal histories of reinforcement, but one has some extra Pavlovian pairings. So what we can see is the disruption during extinction, that this is the bird that was experiencing just the operant contingency. These are the birds with the operant contingency plus free reinforcers, the Pavlovian plus operant. And you can see that the behavior persists at a higher rate for longer in those birds than the birds just on the operant schedule. So if you want persistent behavior, that's good news. If you don't want persistent behavior, like you're trying to, disrupt a problem behavior, that's bad news. One of our colleagues, Nathan Hall, looked at this with dogs learning a scent discrimination task. And he had 2 sets of dogs, and each dog learned 2 different pairs of scents. One had Pavlovian conditioning, so they just presented the scent, delivered food, scent, food, no response was required. And they looked at a pair of unexposed odors where the dog had not been trained on it, had no prior exposure to that. The other dogs were just exposed to the odor, so they were exposed to the odor but didn't have the Pavlovian pairing. They didn't smell the smell and then get a treat, compared to an unexposed. And what we see and he had 3 different disruptors. He did pre-feeding, where he fed the dogs a lot of food before they performed the task, and he fed a lot, like 300% of their normal meal, and the dogs are like, I'm fine, I can keep working, I'm still hungry. So our dogs are hard to disrupt with food. And then he did one where there's a distraction, so he put pepperoni in their detection area, so they had to work through this really distracting scent, and then also in extinction. And what we see that in the Pavlovian conditioning, the open triangles, they are less susceptible to disruption. They continue to perform at a higher rate compared to either the unexposed scents that they had, or even these animals that had contacted the scent as frequently as the Pavlovian pairing did, but didn't have Pavlovian conditioning going on. They were just allowed to smell the smell. So we see even in dogs that this behavioral momentum can impact performance. So where does this occur with dogs? I think potentially problem behaviors, right? It makes me rethink every time I have a reactive dog on leash, there's another dog coming down and I'm giving treats, that if I ever do want to need to put that barking on extinction, it might be harder to disrupt. I don't have a good solution for all of this, but I think this is why we have challenges. And when we have problems in our training, remember back on how complex this is and how impressive it is you get the behavior change that you do. So if we wrap up, we see why animal training is so challenging. We see effects of the value of reinforcers, the quantity and quality and the schedule of reinforcement. We get all this complexity in our quadrants with competing contingencies within a response, between different responses, and then both Pavlovian and operant interactions that can vary in ways that we might not have expected. So my take-home message is kudos to you all for bringing about the behavior change that you do. I think it's hugely impressive. You're working in a noisy system with lots of competing contingencies, and then you add, and that's just the dogs, right? Then you add, or the cats, and then you add the owners in, and it's amazing how successful we are when you're trying to manage both animal behavior and human behavior. So thank you all very much. I've enjoyed speaking to all of you. I'm, like I said, a behavior nerd, so feel free to contact me. I'm always happy to chat behavior. Dogs, horses, and cats, as you well know now. And I think I have time for questions if you have any. Yes?
Going back to, praising while you give the treat, has anybody done anything about whether that gets a condition up in the value of praise on its own, if it's been paired with food?
Right, no, that's a good question of does it actually then condition the praise as, as a reinforcement? No, you're good. I think Stephen Payne, who's at Cal State Fresno, has been working on that and has demonstrated that there is an effect. I don't think he's looked at the delivery method of, do I have to praise first and then give the food versus can I give them concurrently and have it conditioned. I mean, from traditional Pavlovian conditioning, the delivering it first and then giving food would typically, we would expect would be the most effective rather than simultaneous, but it could vary with these conditions. But there does seem to be that it is conditionable, which is good. Yeah. Yes.
My question might be sort of along those same lines. You were talking earlier about petting as being less effective.
Yeah.
Is it the type of petting? Is it the way you're petting? Did you do any changes in that to see if that
No.
how they react to petting versus food?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And I have a lot of data that I didn't present looking at dogs' preferences, and a lot of them do actually prefer petting, and our shelter dogs are the ones that are more likely to prefer petting even over food.
It was the kind of petting.
Yes, but I'm getting to that. So I'm just giving you a broader picture first. So we do find that petting is likely an unconditioned stimulus. There's evidence back from one of Pavlov's students, Horsley Gant, looking at this with, he called it the effective person, that petting can reduce heart rate and blood pressure and things like that. We did what other people have done, sort of a scratching where they have to, you kind of move the skin across the muscle, but we haven't explored that. What we did was the dogs could arrange themselves however they want to, so they got petted on their preferred spot. But I think that would be interesting to look at, that maybe some dogs like stroking versus scritching. That hasn't been explored, but I think it is important to say, even though my data are like, it's not that effective as a reinforcer in that conditions, I think there are conditions where it is reinforcing, that it is highly preferred. And across like 24 minutes of petting, we didn't see any satiation effects from dogs or shelter dogs or own dogs, or like just keep it coming. Vocal praise is a different thing. You do have to specifically condition vocal praise.